A millionaire saved a little beggar girl who lived on the street and took her to his home. Years later, he was in shock when he found out who the girl's real father was. The warehouse echoed with the metallic sound of a gunshot, followed by Sarah's heart-wrenching scream. Daniel Morgan felt the sharp pain pierce his side before he even registered what had happened. His hand instinctively pressed against the wound, warm blood seeping through his fingers as he staggered backward, his eyes fixed on Christopher Bennett, the man he had once considered his closest friend. Dad Sarah's desperate cry cut through the tension-filled air as she tried to rush forward, but Christopher's men held her back. The teenage girl's face was streaked with tears, her eyes wide with horror as she watched her father stumble. "You never understood." Daniel Christopher's voice was cold, emotionless as he kept the gun trained on Daniel. "She was never meant to be yours. Everything you built your life around was a lie." Daniel's vision began to blur, but he fought to stay conscious. Through the haze of pain, he could see Sarah struggling against her captors, her face a mirror of the little girl he had raised and loved for so many years. "Sarah," he gasped, don't let them." The distant wail of police sirens pierced the night, growing louder with each passing second. Panic erupted among Christopher's men, their shadows dancing across the warehouse walls in the dim light. "Boss, we need to move," one shouted, already heading for the exit. Christopher's face twisted with conflicting emotions as he looked between Sarah and Daniel. "Time to go," he commanded, grabbing Sarah's arm roughly. "No," Sarah screamed, fighting harder. "Dad, please don't leave him." Daniel tried to push himself up, every movement sending waves of agony through his body. "Take your hands off my daughter," he growled, but his strength was fading fast. The sirens were deafening now, red and blue lights flashing through the warehouse windows. Christopher's men scattered like rats, but Christopher himself stood firm, still gripping Sarah. "But she was never your daughter, Daniel. Remember that as you bleed out alone, just like I was left alone all those years ago." As darkness began to creep into the edges of his vision, Daniel watched helplessly as Christopher dragged Sarah toward the back exit. His daughter's screams echoed through the warehouse, mixing with the approaching sirens and the sound of police officers shouting orders outside. The last thing Daniel saw before consciousness slipped away was Sarah's terrified face looking back at him, her hand reaching out as she disappeared into the darkness. "I'll find you," he whispered, though no one could hear him. "I promise." If this intense opening has captured your attention, join us on this emotional journey by subscribing to our channel. Each story we share delves deeper into the human heart, exploring raw emotions, unbreakable bonds, and the power of love against all odds. Daniel Morgan wasn't born into wealth, he built his empire from the ground up. At 45, his salt and pepper hair and deep laugh lines told stories of both joy and hardship. Growing up in a small town in Massachusetts, he learned the value of hard work from his working-class parents, carrying those lessons through his ascent from a small-time real estate agent to one of Boston's most respected property developers. But success meant nothing compared to the day he met 7-year-old Sarah at St. Mary's Orphanage. Her big brown eyes and shy smile instantly captured his heart. Despite being single and focused on his career, Daniel knew in that moment his life would never be complete without her. The adoption process was challenging, but he fought through every obstacle, determined to give this little girl the home she deserved. Those first years with Sarah transformed Daniel. Board meetings gave way to ballet recitals, business calls were interrupted by bedtime stories, and his penthouse became filled with stuffed animals and children's laughter. His colleagues often questioned his decision to adopt as a single father, but Daniel never doubted. Every scraped knee bandaged, every nightmare he soothed, every proud moment he witnessed, they all reinforced that Sarah was meant to be his daughter. Daniel built their life with meticulous care. He hired Emily Watson as a live-in nanny, who later became his wife and Sarah's mother figure. Their brownstone in Boston's historic district became a haven of love and security. Daniel made sure Sarah had everything she needed while teaching her the same values his parents had instilled in him: kindness, integrity, and perseverance. His friend and business partner, Christopher Bennett, was also a constant presence in their lives. Christopher had lost his own daughter years ago, and Daniel thought having him around would give Sarah another caring adult figure. How wrong he had been. The memory of Christopher's betrayal still burned like acid in his throat. When Sarah disappeared, Daniel's world shattered. The police suspected him, the media crucified him, and society turned its back. His reputation, carefully built over decades, crumbled overnight. Emily left, unable to bear the weight of suspicion and grief. But Daniel never stopped searching, never stopped believing. He sold properties, spent millions on private investigators, and followed every lead, no matter how small. 8 years of searching changed him. The successful businessman became a shadow of his former self, his only purpose finding Sarah. His office walls, once covered with achievement awards, became a maze of maps, photographs, and possible sightings. He learned to live with the whispers, the accusatory glances, the cruel rumors. None of it mattered, only Sarah did. Now, lying in a pool of his own blood in that warehouse, Daniel finally understood the true price of love. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment of despair had led to this moment. Christopher might have pulled the trigger, but the real wound was seeing Sarah, his daughter, his whole world being dragged away again. As consciousness faded, Daniel's mind filled with memories: Sarah's first day of school, teaching her to ride a bike, her laughter during their Sunday pancake breakfasts. He had given her everything, but most importantly, he had given her his heart. And no bullet, no betrayal, no amount of pain could change that. She was his daughter, not by blood, but by choice, by love, and he would find her again or die trying. At 17, Sarah Morgan carried the weight of 2 lives within her: the cherished daughter of Daniel Morgan and the lost child with a mysterious past. Her reflection in the mirror showed a striking young woman with long dark hair and expressive brown eyes, but behind that exterior lay a soul torn between love and confusion, loyalty and fear. Sarah's earliest memories before Daniel were fragments of darkness, cold nights, strange faces, and a persistent sense of abandonment. The orphanage files claimed she was found wandering the streets at age 5, unable to remember her real name or family. But sometimes, in her nightmares, different memories surfaced: a man's angry voice, a woman crying, the sound of breaking glass. These fragments haunted her, even in the safety of Daniel's love. The years with Daniel were filled with warmth and security. He wasn't just her adoptive father, he was her protector, her guide, her hero. She remembered how he would sit for hours helping her with homework, never losing patience. How he attended every school play, always sitting in the front row with that proud smile. How he taught her to be strong but kind, ambitious but humble. Even Emily, when she joined their family, brought a maternal touch that made their home complete. But the kidnapping changed everything. At 15, Sarah was snatched from their peaceful life and thrust into Christopher Bennett's dark world. He claimed to be her biological father, showing her photos and documents that seemed to prove it. The revelation shattered her understanding of who she was. Christopher spoke of revenge, of justice, of wrongs that needed to be righted. His words were poison, slowly seeping into her mind, making her question everything she believed about Daniel. Under Christopher's influence, Sarah learned to be someone else: harder, colder, more calculating. He trained her in the art of deception, teaching her to use her intelligence for criminal purposes. Part of her knew it was wrong, but Christopher's emotional manipulation and the confusion about her true identity kept her trapped. Every successful heist, every criminal operation felt like a betrayal of Daniel's teachings, yet she couldn't break free. The necklace Daniel had given her became her only anchor to her true self. She kept it hidden from Christopher, taking it out late at night, to remember the father who had given her nothing but love. Sometimes she would cry silently, touching the heart-shaped pendant and remembering Daniel's words, "Your heart is pure, Sarah. Never let anyone change that." The worst part was seeing Daniel's face on news reports, watching him age with grief, knowing she was the cause of his pain. She saw how society turned against him, how he lost everything searching for her. Yet she remained silent, trapped between Christopher's psychological hold and her own confused loyalties. Each time they moved to a new city, each time they planned another operation, Sarah felt the distance between her and Daniel grow larger. Now, seeing Daniel bleeding on the warehouse floor, Sarah finally understood the true cost of her silence. The man who had given her everything was dying because of her inability to stand up to Christopher. The sound of his labored breathing, the sight of his blood spreading across the concrete floor, the echo of his whispered promise to find her, these would forever be etched in her memory. In that moment of crisis, watching Daniel fall, Sarah felt her two identities collide. The sophisticated criminal Christopher had molded her to be crumbled away, revealing the daughter who still desperately loved her father. She realized that blood ties meant nothing compared to the bonds of love and sacrifice that Daniel had shown her. Her true identity wasn't in Christopher's documents or in her forgotten past, it was in every moment of love and care Daniel had given her. As the police sirens wailed outside, Sarah made a silent vow. She would find her way back to Daniel, back to the truth, back to the person he had raised her to be. No matter what Christopher claimed about her past, her future belonged with the father who had chosen her, loved her, and never given up on her. Before the darkness descended, the Morgan household was a beacon of joy and warmth in Boston's historic district. Their Sunday morning ritual was sacred. Daniel would wake early to make his famous chocolate chip pancakes, the aroma drawing Sarah downstairs in her pajamas. Emily would join them, bringing fresh orange juice and her contagious laughter. These mornings were filled with silly jokes, maple syrup competitions, and plans for the day ahead. The family room held countless memories of movie nights, with Sarah nestled between Daniel and Emily on their oversized couch. Daniel would always fall asleep during princess movies, snoring softly while Sarah mouthed every line. Emily would document these moments with her camera, creating albums that captured their perfect little world. Pictures of Sarah's ballet recitals, science fairs, and birthday parties lined the walls, telling the story of a family built on love rather than blood. Their backyard became a wonderland of imagination. Daniel built Sarah a treehouse when she was 9, spending every weekend for a month constructing it despite his complete lack of carpentry skills. The slightly crooked walls and uneven floor made it even more special. Sarah would spend hours up there reading, doing homework, or simply watching the clouds drift by. Sometimes Daniel would climb up too, though the small space barely fit his tall frame, just to share cookies and stories about his day. Holidays were especially magical. Every Christmas, Daniel would let Sarah decorate the tree her way, even if it meant all the ornaments ended up on one side. He'd lift her to place the star on top, a tradition that continued even as she grew older. Emily would bake gingerbread cookies, and the three of them would compete to create the most outrageous decorations. The house would fill with the scent of pine needles and cinnamon, and love so thick you could almost touch it. Summer vacations meant trips to Cape Cod, where they'd rent the same beachfront cottage each year. Daniel taught Sarah to swim, patiently holding her as she learned to trust the waves. They built elaborate sandcastles, collected seashells, and watched the sunset while eating ice cream. Emily would read stories on the beach, doing different voices for each character, until Sarah and Daniel were crying with laughter. School mornings showcased their teamwork, Daniel making breakfast while Emily helped Sarah with her hair, all three rushing around but somehow making it work. If Sarah forgot her lunch or homework, Daniel would always find time to bring it to school, no matter how important his business meetings were. His calendar might have been full of million-dollar deals, but Sarah's science presentation or ballot showcase were always marked in red, unmissable appointments. Even ordinary moments were extraordinary. Daniel helping Sarah with math homework, his business expertise useless against fifth-grade fractions but his patience endless. Emily teaching Sarah to bake, flour covering their clothes and faces as they attempted increasingly complicated recipes. Weekend bike rides through Boston Common, picnics in the public garden, impromptu dance parties in the kitchen. Their life was a tapestry of small, perfect moments. The last normal day before everything changed was beautifully ordinary. They had pizza for dinner, watched a movie, and Daniel tucked Sarah into bed with their usual ritual, a hug, a kiss, and their special words, "Love you more than all the stars." None of them knew it would be the last time, that their perfect world was about to shatter. The pizza box was still in the recycling bin when Sarah disappeared, the last trace of their normal life. Those memories became both a comfort and a torment during the dark years that followed. Daniel would sit in Sarah's unchanged room, surrounded by stuffed animals and school awards, remembering how full of life it once was. Emily would break down at the sight of Sarah's favorite cereal in the grocery store. They clung to these memories like lifelines, proof that their happiness hadn't been a dream, that somewhere beneath the pain and loss, their loving family still existed. The morning Sarah disappeared started like any other. Daniel had kissed her goodbye before leaving for an early meeting, watching her sleepily wave from her bedroom window. By nightfall, that ordinary Tuesday had become the day that would tear their world apart. Sarah never arrived at school. Her phone went straight to voicemail. The space between the last time Daniel saw her smile and the moment he realized something was terribly wrong became an abyss that would haunt him forever. The initial response was swift and sympathetic. Police cars lined their street, helicopters circled overhead, and volunteers combed the neighborhood. Local news covered the story of the prominent businessman's missing daughter, and Boston rallied around the Morgan family. But as days turned into weeks with no leads, whispers began to circulate. Why was there no ransom demand? No signs of forced entry? The same community that had embraced them started to look at Daniel with suspicion. The first blow came from the Boston Herald. Morgan family under investigation. Father named person of interest. The article questioned Daniel's alibi, hinting at financial troubles and suggesting the possibility of insurance fraud. People who had dined at their table now crossed the street to avoid him. Parents pulled their children from Sarah's school as if tragedy was contagious. The whispers grew louder, more venomous. Social media became a weapon, with amateur detectives dissecting every aspect of Daniel's life. They questioned his decision to adopt as a single father years ago, twisted his successful business dealings into something sinister, and even suggested that Sarah wasn't his first victim. Each accusation, no matter how baseless, found fertile ground in a public hungry for scandal. The country club where Daniel had been a member for 15 years quietly suggested he take a leave of absence. Business partners began backing out of deals, citing reputational concerns. The charity board he had served on for a decade asked him to step down. Society's judgment was swift and merciless, condemning him without evidence, without trial. Even their neighbors, the Petersons, who had shared countless barbecues and pool parties with them, installed security cameras pointing directly at Daniel's house. "It's just a precaution," Mrs. Peterson told the local news, her words dripping with insinuation. "We have children to protect." The interview went viral, adding fuel to the growing fires of suspicion. The police investigation became increasingly hostile. Detective Williams, initially sympathetic, now conducted interviews with barely concealed contempt. "Mr. Morgan," he would say, his tone suggesting the title was a mockery. "Why don't you just tell us what really happened to Sarah?" They searched the house 3 times, each warrant more invasive than the last, leaving rooms upturned and memories scattered across floors. Emily stood by him at first, fierce in her defense of his innocence, but the weight of suspicion proved too heavy. She found herself followed in grocery stores, confronted by strangers demanding the truth. Her teaching position at the local elementary school became untenable as parents complained about having that woman near their children. The strain showed in her eyes, in the tremor of her hands, in the growing distance between them. The church they had attended since Sarah's adoption quietly suggested they might be more comfortable worshipping elsewhere. Their pastor, who had baptized Sarah and counseled them through the adoption process, couldn't meet Daniel's eyes as he delivered the news. "Sometimes," he said, fumbling with his collar, "it's best for everyone if we take time to reflect in solitude." The final blow came from Sarah's biological aunt, a woman who had signed away all rights years ago. She appeared on national television, crying crocodile tears about how she had always known something wasn't right about Daniel. The fact that she had never met him, had never been part of Sarah's life, didn't matter. The public had found another villain in their tragedy, and they embraced her story wholeheartedly. Through it all, Daniel kept searching. He hired private investigators, posted flyers, and maintained a website dedicated to finding Sarah. But each effort was twisted by public perception. His desperate attempts to find his daughter were labeled as attempts to maintain his cover story. His pain was called performance, his tears manipulative, his love for Sarah a facading darker truths. The cruel irony was that while society focused on condemning Daniel, the real perpetrators remained free. While detectives wasted time investigating him, precious leads grew cold. While the media crucified an innocent father, Sarah slipped further away into darkness. Justice wasn't just blind, it had turned its back completely. Detective Williams' office felt smaller each time Daniel was called in for questioning. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the detective's face as he shuffled through photographs of Sarah, laying them out like cards in a cruel game. "Let's go through your timeline again, Mr. Morgan," he would say, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Every minute detail matters." The interrogations became increasingly aggressive. They questioned Daniel about life insurance policies, about Sarah's trust fund, about business deals that had gone sour. Every aspect of his life was dissected, every decision scrutinized through a lens of suspicion. The detective seemed to take personal pleasure in watching Daniel squirm, in catching supposed inconsistencies in his story. "You know what I think?" Detective Williams leaned forward one day, his coffee breath hot and accusatory. "I think something went wrong that morning. Maybe Sarah discovered something she shouldn't have. Maybe she threatened to tell. Rich men like you, Mr. Morgan, they're used to controlling everything. But children, they can be unpredictable, can't they?" Emily fought alongside Daniel initially, defending him with the fierce loyalty of a mother protecting her family. She sat through police interviews, spoke to reporters, and maintained their united front. But as weeks turned into months, the strain began to show. The suspicious glances from other teachers at her school, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the staff room, the parents who pulled their children from her class, it all began to chip away at her resolve. The breaking point came during a particularly brutal police interrogation. Detective Williams produced photographs of Emily's past old boyfriends, college parties, minor infractions from her youth. "Mrs. Morgan," he said, his voice falsely sympathetic, "are you absolutely sure you know your husband as well as you think you do? Are you willing to risk everything, your career, your reputation, your freedom for him?" That night Emily paced their bedroom, her steps echoing through the empty house. "I can't do this anymore, Daniel," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I want to believe you, I do. But they're saying such terrible things, and Sarah's still gone, and I can't breathe here anymore." Daniel reached for her, but she flinched away. The distance between them, once measured in inches, now felt like miles. "They're making me doubt everything," she continued, her voice breaking. "Every memory, every moment we shared, they're twisting it all into something ugly. And the worst part is, sometimes in the middle of the night I catch myself wondering." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than any accusation from the police. Daniel felt something break inside him, a final thread of hope snapping. "You think I could hurt our daughter?" His voice was barely audible. "You've been with me every day, seen how much I love her, and you still think I could?" Emily packed her bags that night, her movements mechanical, as if she were operating on autopilot. She couldn't look at Daniel as she moved around their bedroom, collecting pieces of her life. The photos of their family she left untouched, frozen moments of happiness that now seemed to mock them both. "I'll have my lawyer contact you," she said at the door, her wedding ring placed carefully on the entry table. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I need to protect myself now. The police, they're building a case, and I can't be part of whatever happens next." Daniel watched her walk away, her figure growing smaller under the streetlights. He wanted to run after her, to make her understand that her departure was the final victory for those who sought to destroy him. Instead, he stood in the doorway of their empty home, the ghost of Sarah's laughter echoing through the halls, and felt the last pieces of his world crumble. The next morning, Emily's departure made headlines. "Wife flees as investigation intensifies." Detective Williams called him in again, a new glint of triumph in his eyes. "Interesting development," he said, sliding a photo of Emily leaving their house across the desk. Guilty conscience finally got to her, maybe? Or did she know too much? Daniel sat in that cold interrogation room, staring at his reflection in the two-way mirror. The man looking back at him was a stranger, haunted eyes, graying hair, deep lines of grief etched into his face. He had lost his daughter, his wife, his reputation, and now the police were circling like vultures, waiting for him to break. But they didn't understand he was already broken. The only thing keeping him together was the desperate hope of finding Sarah. The years following Sarah's disappearance melted into a blur of sleepless nights, endless searches and desperate leads that led nowhere. Daniel transformed his home office into a command center, walls covered with maps, timelines, and photographs. Sarah's face, school pictures, candid shots, age-progressed renderings watched him from every angle as he worked through the night, fueled by coffee and determination. He sold his properties one by one, liquidating assets to fund private investigators and reward money. His once thriving business empire crumbled, but Daniel barely noticed. Money meant nothing compared to finding Sarah. Each morning brought new hope, each evening crushed it, yet he persisted. He learned to function on 2 hours of sleep, to ignore the whispers that followed him through grocery stores, to live with the constant ache in his chest. The first Christmas without Sarah nearly destroyed him. Emily had always decorated the house, filling it with lights and warmth. Now, Daniel sat alone in the darkness, Sarah's unopened presence gathering dust under a tree he couldn't bring himself to take down. He played their old home videos on repeat, his daughter's laughter a ghost in the empty rooms. When neighbors complained about the Christmas lights still burning in February, he simply paid the fines and left them on. What if Sarah was trying to find her way home? Private investigator after private investigator took his money and offered nothing but dead ends. Some were sympathetic, others clearly thought him guilty, but all eventually gave up. Only Kevin Sullivan, a young detective who'd been fired for defending Daniel, stayed committed to the case. Together they followed leads across the country, chasing shadows and whispers, always one step behind. Daniel joined support groups for parents of missing children, finding both solace and despair in their shared pain. He learned their stories, their children's names, the dates that marked their own personal apocalypses. Some found closure, others didn't. Some marriages survived, most didn't. All of them carried the same haunted look he saw in his mirror every morning. The media's interest waned as newer tragedies captured public attention, but the stigma remained. Job applications were rejected, loan requests denied, old friends crossed the street to avoid him. Daniel learned to shop at night when stores were empty, to keep his head down, to expect the worst from people. His only regular human contact was with Kevin and a small group of loyal employees who stood by him despite the cost to their own reputations. Sarah's room became both sanctuary and torture chamber. Daniel kept it exactly as she left it, homework still on the desk, favorite stuffed animal still on the bed, calendar forever frozen on that Tuesday in September. Some nights he slept on her floor, surrounded by the fading scent of her strawberry shampoo. clinging to the last tangible pieces of her presence. Each year on Sarah's birthday, Daniel bought a cake and sang to an empty chair. He kept up with her grade level, imagining her milestones: middle school graduation, first dance, driver's license. He wrote her letters every day, filling notebooks with everything he wished he could tell her. When the pain became unbearable, he read them aloud to her empty room, hoping somehow she could hear him, know that he never stopped looking, never stopped loving her. Christopher's betrayal cut deeper as time passed. The man had been there through everything: the adoption, the happy years, the disappearance. He'd held Daniel up during the worst moments, helped fund the searches, seemed as devastated as Daniel himself. Learning later that Christopher had orchestrated it all would shatter Daniel's ability to trust forever. The lowest point came 3 years in, when Detective Williams appeared at his door with a grim expression. They'd found remains matching Sarah's description in a wooded area outside the city. Daniel spent 3 days in a cold police station, waiting for DNA results, feeling his soul die by inches. When the tests came back negative, the relief was almost worse than the dread. Another dead end, another flash of hope extinguished. Yet somehow Daniel kept going. He developed a routine: check missing persons databases every morning, update the website dedicated to finding Sarah, follow up on tips, no matter how unlikely, and spend evenings adding to the investigation boards that filled his house. The search consumed him, became his reason for breathing. Some called it obsession, but for Daniel, it was survival. As long as he was searching, Sarah wasn't truly gone. 8 years passed this way, each day a battle against despair, each night a struggle with memories. Daniel aged decades in those years, his hair turning completely grey, deep lines etching themselves around his eyes. But he never stopped believing she was alive, never stopped hoping. Even when the police officially labeled it a cold case, even when his own lawyer suggested declaring Sarah legally dead, Daniel refused to give up. The break-in itself seemed ordinary at first, another violation in a life already shattered by loss. Daniel returned home late one night to find his front door ajar, the alarm system disabled with professional precision. The house had been methodically ransacked, drawers emptied, furniture overturned, but something felt different about this invasion, something deliberate in its execution. Standing in his disheveled living room, Daniel noticed that certain items remained untouched: the expensive electronics, the safe behind his office painting, items any common thief would have taken. Instead, the intruders had focused on personal spaces, areas containing family memories. Sarah's room, untouched for 8 years, had been particularly disturbed. Then he saw it, deliberately placed in the center of the coffee table: Sarah's heart-shaped silver necklace, the one he'd given her on her last birthday. The pendant caught the dim light, its familiar inscription still visible: to my beloved daughter, forever in my heart. Daniel's hands trembled as he picked it up, the metal warm as if it had just been worn. "Impossible," he whispered, clutching the necklace. He'd watched Sarah wear it every day, had seen it around her neck the morning she disappeared. The police had listed it in their evidence file, one of the items they'd searched for but never found. Yet here it was, 8 years later, placed like a deliberate message in his ransacked home. Kevin arrived within minutes of Daniel's frantic call, his police training evident in how he immediately secured the scene. "This isn't random, Daniel," he said, examining the necklace with gloved hands. "This is staged. They wanted you to find this." The police response was predictably skeptical. Detective Williams, now grey and close to retirement but still harboring his suspicions, suggested Daniel had planted the necklace himself. "Convenient timing," he sneered, "just when the case is about to be archived." But even he couldn't explain why a father would stage a break-in to plant evidence of his own guilt. Forensics teams swept the house, photographing everything, dusting for prints. Daniel watched them work, the necklace now sealed in an evidence bag, feeling simultaneously closer to and further from Sarah than he had in years. Every detail of the break-in suggested professional criminals, not the work of a desperate father trying to revive a cold case. That night, after the police left, Daniel sat in his study examining photographs of the scene. The intruders had accessed files about Sarah's disappearance, had gone through old family albums, had specifically targeted items connected to her. This wasn't a robbery, it was a message. But from whom? And why now, after 8 years? The security cameras had been disabled with expertise, leaving no useful footage. However, a neighbor's doorbell camera caught a glimpse of a black van leaving the area around the time of the break-in. The image was blurry, but it was something the first real lead in years. Daniel couldn't sleep, his mind racing with possibilities. The necklace meant Sarah was alive, or at least had been recently enough to possess it. Someone wanted him to know that, wanted him to understand that his daughter's disappearance wasn't the random tragedy everyone believed. This was orchestrated, planned, and now, for some reason, the orchestrators were reaching out. The next morning, local news stations camped outside his house, drawn by police scanner chatter about new evidence in the Morgan case. Daniel watched from his window as reporters speculated about the break-in, some suggesting it validated their 8-year-old suspicions about his involvement in Sarah's disappearance. But Daniel barely registered their presence. His focus was entirely on the necklace, now in police custody. Every detail of that piece of jewelry was seared into his memory, how Sarah's face had lit up when he gave it to her, how she promised never to take it off, how it had caught the light that last morning as she waved goodbye. Now it had returned like a ghost, carrying with it a message he was desperate to understand. Kevin worked his contacts in the police department, trying to fast-track the forensic analysis. Someone's playing a game, Daniel, he warned. We need to be careful how we respond, but Daniel was already planning his next move. The necklace wasn't just evidence, it was proof that Sarah was out there somewhere, and whoever had orchestrated this break-in knew exactly where she was. The second robbery occurred just 3 days after the first, this time at the Thompson estate across town. Daniel had been tracking police frequencies ever since finding Sarah's necklace, and when the call came through about a break-in in progress, something compelled him to drive there. The same black van had been spotted, and his instinct screamed that this wasn't coincidence. Under the cover of darkness, Daniel parked his car at a safe distance and approached the mansion on foot. The security lights were disabled, and he could see shadowy figures moving efficiently through the house. His heart nearly stopped when he caught a glimpse of one particular figure, a young woman with familiar, graceful movements that sent shivers down his spine. Through the ground floor window, he watched her directing the operation with silent hand signals. She moved with practiced precision, her long dark hair partially concealed under a black cap. Something about her posture, the way she carried herself, resonated deep within Daniel's memory. Then she turned, and moonlight caught her face, a face he'd seen every day in the age progression photos that haunted his walls. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely a breath. She looked so much like Emily now, the same high cheekbones and determined set of her jaw. But there was something hard in her eyes, something cold that hadn't been there before. This wasn't the laughing child from his memories, this was someone shaped by years of unknown hardships. The young woman suddenly tensed, as if sensing his presence. Her eyes swept the darkness and locked with his for a brief, electric moment. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by something that looked like pain. She pressed her hand against the window glass, and Daniel saw it, a thin chain around her neck, disappearing beneath her collar. His heart told him it was another silver heart pendant. Before he could move or speak, another figure appeared behind her, a tall man with a scarred face who placed a warning hand on her shoulder. The man's eyes narrowed as he scanned the darkness, and Daniel instinctively withdrew deeper into the shadows. When he looked again, Sarah was gone, pulled back into the house by her companion. The robbery crew emerged minutes later, moving with military precision toward their van. Daniel watched helplessly as Sarah climbed into the passenger seat, her movements suggesting both urgency and reluctance. As the van pulled away, she looked back once, her gaze finding him unerringly in the darkness. Then they were gone, leaving Daniel with the certainty that his daughter was alive, but trapped in a world he didn't understand. Police sirens wailed in the distance as Daniel stood rooted to the spot, his mind reeling. Sarah was alive. She was part of a professional criminal crew. She had recognized him. Each realization hit him like a physical blow, mixing joy, horror, and determination into a volatile cocktail of emotions. The next morning, Daniel sat in Kevin's office, his hands shaking as he recounted what he'd seen. It was her, Kevin. She's grown up, but I'd know my daughter anywhere. Someone has turned her into this, someone is using her. His voice broke on the last words, anger and grief warring in his chest. Kevin listened intently, taking notes and cross-referencing them with police reports. The crew's been hitting high-end properties across 3 states, he explained. Always professional, always clean. No one's been able to get close until now. He paused, studying Daniel's face. But why would they deliberately let you see her? Why leave the necklace? Daniel stared at the crime scene photos spread across Kevin's desk, his mind racing. They're sending a message. This isn't just about the robberies, it's about me. Someone wants me to know they have her, wants me to see what they've turned her into. As they talked, a pattern emerged. Each robbery targeted homes connected to Daniel's old business circle. The timing, the precision, the deliberate clues, it all pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of his life, someone with a grudge deep enough to steal his daughter and spend 8 years molding her into a criminal. But who? And more importantly, how could he save Sarah without driving her further away? The young woman he'd seen wasn't a helpless victim anymore, she was an active participant in these crimes. Yet Daniel had seen the flash of recognition in her eyes, the moment of connection through the window. His daughter was still in there, beneath whatever layers of manipulation and survival she'd built around herself. The connection to Christopher Bennett emerged like a nightmare slowly taking shape in the light of day. While reviewing security footage from neighboring properties, Kevin noticed something peculiar. The scarred man from the robbery matched photographs of someone who had regularly visited Christopher's office in the weeks before Sarah's disappearance. Daniel felt his world tilt on its axis as he remembered Christopher's behavior over the years. His old friend had been the most supportive during the search for Sarah, contributing money, time, and resources. He'd attended every press conference, consoled Daniel through countless breakdowns, even helped maintain Sarah's website. The perfection of his performance now seemed grotesque. "Look at this," Kevin said, spreading financial records across his desk. Christopher's company made a series of large transfers to offshore accounts right before Sarah disappeared. Then again, every year on the same date. The implication hung heavy in the air. These weren't random payments, they were scheduled maintenance of a long-term operation. Daniel's mind raced back through the years, re-examining every interaction with Christopher through this new lens. The late-night strategy sessions, the seemingly endless supply of private investigators, the constant presence during the darkest moments. Christopher hadn't been supporting him, he'd been monitoring him, ensuring his plan remained undiscovered. But why? Daniel's voice cracked as he asked the question that burned in his throat. "We were friends for 20 years. He was there when I adopted Sarah, helped me raise her. How could he?" Kevin pulled up Christopher's personal history on his computer, his face grim. "There's more. Christopher had a daughter who died in a car accident 15 years ago. She would have been Sarah's age." He paused, letting the information sink in. The accident happened on the same date as the annual payments. The pieces started falling into place with sickening clarity. Christopher's obsession with Sarah during her early years, his insistence on being involved in every aspect of her life, the way he'd sometimes stare at her with an intensity that should have raised red flags. Daniel had attributed it all to the pain of losing his own child, never suspecting the darkness that lay beneath. "He's recreating his family," Daniel whispered, horror dawning in his voice. "He took Sarah because she reminded him of his daughter. He spent 8 years molding her into some twisted replacement." Security footage from Christopher's current residence showed regular visits from the black van, the same van that had been at both robberies, that had taken Sarah away. Christopher had built an entire criminal enterprise, using Sarah as his centerpiece, training her to become what his lost daughter never could. Daniel remembered Christopher's words at countless charity events. "Family is everything. Sometimes you have to take destiny into your own hands." The platitudes now carried sinister undertones. Christopher hadn't just taken Sarah, he'd stolen 8 years of her life, warped her into something she was never meant to be. Kevin laid a hand on Daniel's shoulder as the older man slumped in his chair. "We need to be careful how we handle this," he warned. "Christopher's powerful, connected. If we move too quickly, he might disappear with Sarah again. Or worse." Looking at Christopher's current photos, Daniel barely recognized his old friend. Success had hardened him, grief had twisted him, and obsession had turned him into someone capable of destroying a family to rebuild his own. The man who had stood beside Daniel at Sarah's adoption ceremony, who had helped teach her to ride a bike, who had shared holidays and celebrations, that person had been a masterful performance. "He'll never let her go willingly," Daniel realized, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "She's not just a replacement daughter to him anymore, she's his redemption, his second chance. He spent 8 years crafting her into his perfect creation." As if to confirm their discoveries, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It contained a single photo: Sarah as a teenager, sitting at a piano, Christopher standing behind her with a possessive hand on her shoulder. The message read, "She has a better life now. Let her go or everyone loses." The threat was clear, but it only strengthened Daniel's resolve. Christopher had orchestrated this entire revelation, from the necklace to the robbery sighting. He was flaunting his control, daring Daniel to try and reclaim his daughter. What he didn't understand was that Daniel had spent 8 years with nothing but the hope of finding Sarah. Now that he knew she was alive, now that he had a target for his pain and rage, nothing would stop him from bringing her home. The investigation into Christopher Bennett's life became Daniel's new obsession. With Kevin's help, they transformed Daniel's home office into an operations center, walls covered with surveillance photos, financial records, and maps tracking the robbery crew's movements. Every detail of Christopher's life was scrutinized, every connection explored, every pattern analyzed. Kevin's law enforcement background proved invaluable. He used his contacts to access sealed records, revealing a pattern of behavior in Christopher's past that should have raised red flags years ago. There were restraining orders from his ex-wife following his daughter's death, consultations with psychiatrists specializing in severe trauma, and a series of increasingly erratic business decisions that coincided with Sarah's adoption. "Look at this," Kevin said one night, spreading surveillance photos across Daniel's desk. "Christopher's crew always hits properties connected to your old business circle. The Thompsons, the Richardsons, the Whitakers, they were all involved in deals with you before Sarah disappeared." The pattern was clear. Christopher wasn't just running a criminal enterprise, he was systematically targeting Daniel's former associates. They discovered Christopher had purchased a secluded compound in the Berkshires 6 months before Sarah's kidnapping. Satellite images showed high-security fences, guard posts, and regular deliveries from shell companies. "This is where he took her," Daniel said, studying the photos. "This is where he rebuilt her world." Working through sleepless nights, they pieced together Christopher's methodology. He had spent years planning Sarah's abduction, using his friendship with Daniel to gather intimate details about their lives. The man had attended every birthday party, every school event, learning Sarah's routines, preferences, and fears. He had weaponized love itself. Financial records revealed a complex web of offshore accounts and shell corporations. Christopher had funneled millions into his operation, creating a shadow empire dedicated to maintaining his illusion of family. He's not just wealthy, Kevin noted, he's obsessive. Every detail is controlled, every contingency planned for. This isn't just about Sarah anymore, it's about maintaining his fantasy. Daniel threw himself into physical training, knowing that eventually he would have to confront Christopher directly. His body, softened by years of grief and desk work, slowly transformed. Each punch thrown at the boxing bag carried 8 years of rage. Each mile run strengthened his resolve to reclaim his daughter. Late one night, as they reviewed security footage from Christopher's compound, Kevin noticed something crucial. The guards change shifts at exactly the same time every night. There's a 3-minute window when the southeast corner is completely unmonitored. It wasn't much, but it was a crack in Christopher's perfect system. They began mapping escape routes, safe houses, and contingency plans. Kevin reached out to trusted former colleagues, building a network of support for when they made their move. We'll only get one chance, he warned. If we fail, Christopher will disappear with Sarah forever. Daniel spent hours studying recent photos of Sarah from the robberies, learning to read the subtle changes in his daughter. He noticed how she held herself differently around Christopher, tense, guarded, like a performer aware of being watched. But in unguarded moments, when she thought no one was looking, glimpses of his little girl shone through. The most disturbing discovery came from Christopher's private medical records. He had been prescribed powerful antipsychotics following his daughter's death, but had stopped taking them shortly before meeting Sarah. His psychiatrist's notes painted a picture of a man increasingly lost in a fantasy world where he could rewrite the past. Their investigation revealed that Christopher had also kept tabs on Emily over the years, ensuring Daniel's ex-wife remained isolated and afraid. Anonymous threats, manipulated evidence, strategic rumors he had orchestrated the complete destruction of Daniel's support system, making Sarah entirely dependent on him. He's created a perfect trap, Kevin observed, studying their evidence wall. Sarah's been isolated, manipulated, and trained to see you as the enemy. Even if we get her out physically, the psychological bonds will be harder to break. Daniel stood before the wall of evidence, taking in the scope of Christopher's obsession. Photos of Sarah, at various ages, were arranged chronologically: school pictures from before, surveillance photos from after. The transformation was heartbreaking. "I don't care how long it takes," he said quietly. "I'll spend the rest of my life helping her heal, if that's what she needs." They discovered that Christopher had scheduled a major auction in 2 weeks, a legitimate event that would gather many of his high society contacts. "It's our best chance," Kevin said. "Security will be focused on the guests. If we're going to move, it has to be then." As they finalized their plans, Daniel found himself returning to Sarah's room each night, sitting on her bed, surrounded by the preserved memories of her childhood. "I'm coming for you," he would whisper to the darkness. "No matter what he's done, no matter what he's turned you into, you're my daughter, and I'm bringing you home." The depth of Christopher's criminal network unfolded like a dark labyrinth before Daniel and Kevin. Through careful investigation, they uncovered not just a series of robberies, but an intricate criminal empire built around Sarah's specialized skills. Christopher had created a network of high-end art thieves, targeting specific pieces with historical significance and personal meaning to their former owners. Each robbery was meticulously planned, with Sarah as the centerpiece. Security footage from various heists showed her disabling complex systems, coordinating team movements, and executing perfect infiltrations. Christopher had trained her to be not just a thief, but an artist of deception. The grace she once showed in ballet recitals now served a darker purpose. "Look at this pattern," Kevin said, pointing to a map dotted with red pins. "Every target has a connection to your past. The Hendersons' Renaissance painting, you helped them acquire it. The Whitaker's jewelry collection, you financed the security system." Christopher wasn't just stealing valuables, he was systematically dismantling Daniel's legacy. Their investigation revealed a network of corrupt security companies, insurance adjusters and art dealers, all working under Christopher's control. He had spent years building this web, using his legitimate business connections as cover. Many of the same people who had turned their backs on Daniel during Sarah's disappearance were now unwittingly helping her commit crimes. The psychological manipulation went deeper than they'd imagined. Christopher had created elaborate backstories for each heist, convincing Sarah that their targets were corrupt individuals who deserved to be robbed. He twisted Daniel's past business dealings into tales of exploitation and greed, manipulating Sarah's sense of justice. Through surveillance photos, they watched Sarah evolve from an unwilling participant to a confident leader. Christopher had shaped her into his ideal of perfection, a blend of his lost daughter and his darker ambitions. He's not just recreating his family, Daniel realized, he's building his own twisted version of justice. Financial records revealed offshore accounts in Sarah's name, Christopher's way of giving her a stake in the operation. But the accounts were carefully controlled, the funds accessible only under specific conditions. He had created a golden cage, making Sarah financially dependent on him even as she appeared to prosper. They discovered a network of safe houses across 3 states, each maintained by loyal members of Christopher's organization. These weren't just criminals, they were people who believed in Christopher's cause, who saw him as a modern-day Robin Hood. Many had tragic backgrounds similar to his, making them susceptible to his manipulation. The most disturbing discovery came from intercepted communications between Christopher and his inner circle. He referred to Sarah as Alexandra, his dead daughter's name, in private messages. The line between reality and fantasy had completely blurred in his mind. He wasn't just using Sarah, he truly believed he was reconstructing his lost family. Kevin's contacts in law enforcement provided insights into the crew's methodology. They're not just thieves, one detective reported. They're ghost stories. They appear, take what they want, and vanish without a trace. No violence, no witnesses, just perfectly executed operations. Through careful observation, they identified key members of Christopher's team: Marcus, the scarred man who acted as Sarah's handler, Lisa, a former acrobat who handled physical security, and James, a computer expert who dismantled digital protections. Each had been carefully chosen and groomed, creating a surrogate family structure around Sarah. The network extended into legitimate businesses, galleries, auction houses, and security firms that helped fence stolen goods and launder proceeds. Christopher had built a self-sustaining ecosystem of crime, with Sarah as its crown jewel. His obsession with perfection had created an almost impenetrable system. They found evidence of psychological conditioning in the early years after Sarah's kidnapping. Therapists on Christopher's payroll had helped treat her trauma, slowly reshaping her memories and loyalties. Every aspect of her new life had been carefully curated to reinforce Christopher's narrative. Daniel spent hours studying surveillance footage of Sarah interacting with the crew. He noticed small gestures, brief moments when her guard dropped a laugh that reminded him of her childhood, a nervous habit she'd never outgrown. These glimpses of his daughter beneath the skilled criminal gave him hope. The scope of Christopher's operation was staggering. He hadn't just stolen Sarah, he had created an entire world around her, complete with its own morality, purpose, and family structure. Breaking her free wouldn't be as simple as physical rescue. They would have to dismantle the psychological fortress Christopher had built. The first real confrontation with Sarah happened on a rainy Tuesday night at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Daniel had tracked the crew's pattern and knew they would target the new Renaissance exhibition. He waited in the shadows of the museum's east wing, his heart pounding as he watched Sarah's team disable the security systems with practiced precision. She moved like a shadow through the darkened gallery, her movements fluid and purposeful. Gone was the carefree girl who used to dance through their home. In her place stood a skilled operative who commanded her team with silent gestures. Daniel waited until she was alone in the Renaissance room before stepping out of the darkness. "Sarah," he said softly, and she froze, her back to him. The security lights cast long shadows across the marble floor, creating a surreal scene among the priceless paintings. Slowly she turned, and Daniel felt his breath catch. Her face, so familiar yet changed, showed a complex mix of emotions: recognition, fear, anger, and something deeper he couldn't quite read. "My name is Alexandra," she replied, her voice steady but strained. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Morgan." The formality of her address felt like a physical blow, but Daniel took a step closer, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. "We both know that's not true. Christopher may have told you to use that name, but you're Sarah Morgan." "You're my daughter." His voice cracked on the last word, and he saw her flinch slightly. "I've spent 8 years searching for you." Sarah's hand moved to her throat, touching the silver heart necklace she wore beneath her tactical gear. "The past is gone," she said, but her fingers trembling on the necklace betrayed her certainty. "Christopher saved me from a life of lies. He showed me who you really are." Daniel took another careful step forward. "What lies, Sarah? That I loved you? That we were happy? Look at that necklace you're wearing, the one you kept all these years. Deep down, you know the truth." A flash of confusion crossed her face, quickly replaced by practiced hardness. "You're a manipulator," she said, reciting words that sounded rehearsed. "You used people, destroyed lives. Christopher showed me the evidence, showed me what you did to those families." "Those were Christopher's lies," Daniel replied gently. "Think, Sarah. Remember Christmas mornings, weekend bike rides, story time before bed. Remember how Emily would braid your hair while I made pancakes. Those weren't lies, they were love." Sarah's composure cracked slightly at the mention of Emily. "Don't," she whispered. "You don't get to talk about those times. You don't get to pretend you were the perfect father when I know the truth." "What truth, Sarah?" "Christopher's truth. The man who stole you from your family, who turned you into a criminal." Daniel's voice remained soft, but urgent. "He's recreating his dead daughter through you. Alexandra, that was his daughter's name. You're living someone else's life." Conflict played across Sarah's face as she processed his words. Her hand tightened around the necklace, and for a moment she looked like the young girl he'd lost. But then footsteps echoed in the corridor, and her walls slammed back into place. "Leave," she commanded, her voice hard again. "Leave now, or I'll call security. You don't understand anything about my life or who I am now." "I understand that my daughter is still in there," Daniel said, even as he backed toward the shadows. "The necklace. Sarah, you kept it all these years because part of you remembers the truth. When you're ready to hear it, I'll be waiting." Marcus, the scarred man, appeared in the doorway. "Alexandra," "We need to move." His hand rested meaningfully on his weapon as he glared at Daniel. Sarah turned away, her shoulders rigid with tension. "Goodbye, Mr. Morgan. Don't try to find me again." But as she walked away, Daniel saw her hand still clutched around the necklace, and he knew his words had found a crack in Christopher's carefully constructed walls. Later that night, as Daniel recounted the encounter to Kevin, he felt a mix of heartbreak and hope. "She's in there," he said firmly. "Beneath everything Christopher's done to her, Sarah's still there. She kept the necklace, Kevin. She remembered Emily." The encounter had proven their suspicions. Christopher's control over Sarah wasn't absolute, but it had also shown how deeply his manipulation ran. Breaking through years of psychological conditioning wouldn't be easy, but Daniel had seen a glimpse of his daughter behind the facade. It was enough to strengthen his resolve. The warehouse loomed against the night sky, its abandoned exterior masking the confrontation brewing within. Daniel approached cautiously, Kevin's warning still echoing in his mind. "Christopher's expecting you. This could be a trap." But the anonymous tip about Sarah's presence here was too important to ignore, even if it meant walking into Christopher's web. The interior was dimly lit by scattered industrial lights, creating deep shadows between massive storage containers. Daniel's footsteps echoed on the concrete floor as he moved deeper into the building, every sense alert for danger. The air was thick with tension and the metallic smell of machinery. He found them in a cleared area at the center of the warehouse. Sarah stood beside Christopher, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Several armed men positioned themselves strategically around them, including Marcus with his signature scar. Christopher smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Daniel, Christopher's voice carried across the space. I was wondering when you'd accept my invitation. Though I must say, your persistence these past weeks has become rather tiresome. He kept one hand on Sarah's shoulder, a gesture both protective and possessive. Let her go, Christopher, Daniel said, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. This game you're playing, this fantasy you've created, it's over. Sarah deserves to know the truth. Christopher's laugh echoed off the metal walls. The truth? You mean your version of it? Sarah Alexandra knows exactly who she is now. I've given her purpose, direction, a real family. What did you give her except lies and abandonment? Sarah shifted uncomfortably, her hand unconsciously moving to the silver necklace. Daniel noticed the gesture and pressed on. Tell him about the necklace, Sarah. Tell him why you kept it all these years, why you still wear it. Deep down, you know who really loves you. Enough. Christopher's composure cracked slightly. Alexandra, dear, why don't you tell Daniel about all the families he destroyed? About the lives he ruined with his corrupt business dealings? Tell him what you've learned about his true nature. But Sarah remained silent, her eyes darting between the two men who claimed to be her father. The warehouse felt charged with electricity, years of manipulation and love colliding in this moment. She's not Alexandra, Daniel said quietly, taking a step forward despite the armed men tensing around him. Your daughter died, Christopher. I am so sorry for your loss, but Sarah isn't her. You can't replace one child with another and call it love. Christopher's face contorted with rage. You know nothing about love. I saved her from you, gave her a life of purpose. Everything she is now, every skill, every achievement, that's my doing. You're nothing but a memory she's outgrown. A memory. Daniel's voice rose. I'm the one who held her through nightmares, who taught her to ride a bike, who loved her unconditionally. You're the one living in a memory, Christopher. You're so lost in grief that you've destroyed an innocent girl's life trying to bring back your dead daughter. Sarah suddenly spoke, her voice trembling. Stop it, both of you. Her hands were shaking as she stepped away from Christopher. I remember things. Things that don't match what you told me, Christopher. The necklace. My birthday. Emily. Christopher's face paled. Alexandra, darling, those are false memories. We've discussed this. Daniel Morgan is a manipulator, a criminal. Everything I've shown you proves it. My name is Sarah, she whispered. Then louder, my name is Sarah Morgan. The words seemed to surprise her as much as everyone else. Daniel felt his heart surge with hope, but Christopher's reaction was instant and violent. He grabbed Sarah's arm roughly, his careful facade crumbling. No, I didn't spend 8 years reshaping you, training you, making you perfect, just to lose you to him. The movement triggered chaos. Marcus and his men raised their weapons, but Sarah twisted free from Christopher's grip, her training now working against him. She backed away from both men, tears streaming down her face. You told me he abandoned me, she said to Christopher, her voice breaking. You said he never looked for me, but he never stopped searching, did he? All those newspaper articles you kept hidden, the search parties, the rewards, he never gave up on me. Christopher's face transformed into something desperate and dangerous. Everything I did was for you. I gave you a better life, made you stronger. He would have kept you weak, ordinary. I made you extraordinary. You made me a criminal, Sarah replied, backing toward Daniel. You stole my life and replaced it with a dead girl's identity. The necklace. I kept it because somewhere inside I never stopped being Sarah Morgan. The warehouse fell silent except for the sound of Sarah's quiet sobs. Daniel wanted to reach for her, to hold her like he had when she was small, but he knew one wrong move could still end in tragedy. Christopher raised his gun, his hand shaking. "If I can't have my daughter back," he said, his voice breaking, "then neither can you." The gunshot echoed through the warehouse before anyone could react. This devastating moment would change everything, setting in motion a chain of events that would test the limits of love, forgiveness, and redemption. The truth was finally emerging, but at what cost? In the chaos following the gunshot, Christopher's demeanor suddenly shifted. His hand still gripping the smoking gun, he let out a laugh that bordered on hysteria. "You still don't understand, do you, Daniel? This isn't just about replacing Alexandra. Sarah is mine, she always was. I'm her biological father." The revelation hit the warehouse like a physical force. Sarah, who had been moving toward Daniel, froze mid-step. Daniel felt the world tilt beneath his feet as Christopher continued, his voice taking on an almost dreamy quality. "It was 15 years ago," Christopher said, lowering the gun slightly. "A brief affair with a woman named Rachel Stevens. She never told me she was pregnant, never said a word about the baby. By the time I found out, she had already given Sarah up for adoption. And then by some twisted joke of fate, my best friend Daniel Morgan adopted my own flesh and blood." Sarah's hands trembled as she touched her necklace, her eyes wide with confusion. You knew. All this time you knew, and you still." Her voice cracked with the weight of this new betrayal. "I watched you grow up from afar," Christopher continued, his eyes fever bright. "Watched another man raise my daughter, love my daughter, shape my daughter. Do you know what that did to me? When Alexandra died, it felt like a sign. I could finally reclaim what was mine." Daniel stepped forward, placing himself between Christopher and Sarah. "Even if what you're saying is true, it changes nothing. You didn't lose Sarah, you stole her. You destroyed her childhood, twisted her into your own image. That's not love, Christopher, that's obsession." Christopher's laugh turned bitter. "Obsession? I gave her everything. Skills, purpose, strength. While you were teaching her bedtime stories, I was preparing her for reality. The world isn't your soft, comfortable bubble, Daniel. I made her exceptional." "You made me a weapon." Sarah's voice cut through the tension. "You didn't want a daughter, you wanted revenge. Against Daniel, against my birth mother, against the world that took Alexandra from you. I was never more than a tool for your pain." The truth of her words seemed to physically impact Christopher. His composed facade crumbled completely, revealing the broken man beneath. No, you don't understand. Everything I did was for you. The training, the heists, all of it. I was making you strong enough to survive in this world. By turning me into a criminal," Sarah's voice rose. "By making me hurt people? Daniel taught me about love, about kindness. You taught me how to steal, how to lie, how to hurt people. What kind of father does that to his child?" Christopher's grip on the gun tightened. "I am your father, your real father. DNA doesn't lie, Sarah. You belong with me. Everything else, your life with Daniel, your memories, your moral compass, it's all built on lies." "Biology doesn't make a father," Daniel said quietly, his voice steady despite the gun pointed at his chest. "Love does. Sacrifice does. Being there every day, through nightmares and triumphs, through scraped knees and broken hearts, that's what makes a father." Sarah moved to stand beside Daniel, her decision clear in every line of her body. "Even if you are my biological father, you lost the right to call yourself my father the day you kidnapped me. A real father protects their child. You destroyed my life to rebuild your own." Christopher's face contorted with rage and grief. "No, I won't lose another daughter. I won't let him take you from me again." He raised the gun higher, his finger tightening on the trigger. "If I can't have you, Sarah, then neither can he." The warehouse echoed with another gunshot, but this time it wasn't from Christopher's weapon. Detective Williams stood in the doorway, his service weapon raised. "Drop the gun, Bennett. It's over." As police officers flooded the warehouse, Christopher's empire crumbled around him. The man who had orchestrated 8 years of manipulation and crime stood frozen, watching as his carefully constructed world fell apart. His last words before the officers reached him were directed at Sarah. "Everything I did was for love." The warehouse erupted into chaos as Christopher made one final, desperate move. Despite Detective Williams' warning shot, he swung his gun toward Daniel with murderous intent. If I can't have her, no one will. The sound of his shot echoed off the metal walls like a thunderclap. Sarah's scream pierced the air as Daniel stumbled backward, blood blooming across his chest. She rushed to catch him as he fell, her training forgotten in the face of pure terror. "Dad." "No, please, no." The word "Dad" escaped her lips naturally, instinctively, as if 8 years of conditioning had evaporated in that single moment. Christopher stood frozen, the gun still smoking in his hand, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of horror and satisfaction. Detective Williams and his team converged on him, but the damage was already done. In the confusion, Marcus and his men opened fire, turning the warehouse into a war zone. Sarah cradled Daniel's head in her lap, tears streaming down her face as she pressed her hands against his wound. "Stay with me, please stay with me," she begged, her voice breaking. "I remember everything now. The pancake sundaes, the bedtime stories, the bike rides in the park. You're my real father. Please don't leave me." Daniel reached up with a trembling hand to touch her face, leaving a faint trace of blood on her cheek. "I knew you were still in there," he whispered through the pain. "My Sarah. My beautiful daughter." His eyes began to flutter closed as the sound of gunfire and shouting continued around them. Detective Williams' voice boomed over the chaos. "Ceasefire. Drop your weapons," the authority in his command cut through the mayhem. One by one, Christopher's men lowered their guns, realizing the futility of their situation as more police officers poured into the warehouse. Christopher himself stood in the middle of it all, a broken man watching his carefully constructed world collapse. "She was supposed to be mine," he muttered, the gun slipping from his fingers. "My second chance. My second chance. My redemption." As officers moved to handcuff him, he locked eyes with Sarah. "I really am your father, Sarah. Remember that." Sarah didn't even look at him. Her entire world had narrowed to Daniel's pale face and labored breathing. "Someone help. Please, he's dying," her voice carried the desperate edge of a child about to lose everything all over again. Paramedics rushed in, gently but firmly moving Sarah aside to work on Daniel. She watched, trembling, as they cut away his shirt and applied pressure bandages. The technical terms they shouted back and forth meant nothing to her. All she could focus on was the weak rise and fall of his chest. Blood pressure dropping. "Need immediate evac." "Stay with us, sir." The warehouse became a blur of motion and urgency. Detective Williams approached Sarah, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We need to get you checked out too," he said softly. "You're in shock." But Sarah shook her head, her eyes never leaving Daniel as the paramedics transferred him to a stretcher. "I'm going with him," she stated, her voice leaving no room for argument. "I've lost 8 years with my father. I won't lose another minute." As they rushed Daniel to the waiting ambulance, Sarah held his hand tightly. The same hands that had once pushed her on swings, braided her hair, and wiped away her tears were now cold and limp in her grasp. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had finally remembered who she truly was, finally chosen her real father, only to face losing him forever. In the ambulance, racing through the streets of Boston with sirens wailing, Sarah whispered the words she had been programmed to forget. "I love you, Dad." More than all the stars, a tear fell onto their clasped hands as Daniel's vital signs beeped weakly on the monitor. Back at the warehouse, Christopher was led away in handcuffs, his empire in ruins. Detective Williams watched the scene with a mixture of satisfaction and regret. 8 years of mystery had finally been solved, but at what cost? The truth about Sarah's biological father would have to wait. Right now, the only father that mattered was fighting for his life in an ambulance racing toward Boston General. The harsh fluorescent lights of Boston General's ICU cast stark shadows across Sarah's face as she maintained her vigil by Daniel's bedside. The steady beep of heart monitors and the hiss of oxygen machines created a mechanical lullaby that marked the hours. Daniel lay still, pale against white hospital sheets, tubes and wires connecting him to machines that kept him alive. His condition is stable but critical, the doctors had said. The next 48 hours are crucial. Sarah barely registered their words, her focus entirely on the rise and fall of Daniel's chest, each breath a small victory against death. The bullet had missed his heart by inches, but the blood loss and trauma had pushed his body to its limits. During those long hours, memories flooded back with devastating clarity. Every moment Christopher had twisted, every truth he had distorted, began to unravel. Sarah remembered her 8th birthday party, how Daniel had spent weeks planning the perfect surprise. She remembered him teaching her to ride a bike, his patient hands steadying her until she found her balance. Each memory felt like a knife, cutting through years of Christopher's careful conditioning. Kevin appeared regularly, bringing coffee and quiet support. The police have Christopher in custody, he reported softly. They found DNA evidence confirming his claim about being your biological father. Sarah nodded numbly, the information feeling somehow both monumental and irrelevant. Biology meant nothing compared to the man fighting for his life before her. Nurses came and went, checking vitals and adjusting medications. They spoke in gentle tones about visiting hours and the need for rest, but Sarah refused to leave. I abandoned him once, she told them, her voice raw. Never again, they seemed to understand, bringing her extra blankets and turning a blind eye to her constant presence. The worst moments came in the dead of night when the hospital quieted and Sarah was alone with her thoughts. The weight of her actions over the past 8 years crashed over her like waves. She had participated in crimes, hurt innocent people, all while her real father searched desperately for her. Christopher's manipulation felt like poison in her veins. How could she have ever believed his lies? On the 3rd night, Daniel's fever spiked dangerously high. Sarah watched helplessly as medical staff rushed around him, their urgent whispers and quick movements betraying their concern. She found herself praying to a god she'd long since stopped believing in, bargaining with the universe. "Please," she whispered, clutching Daniel's cold hand. "Please don't take him. I just found him again." Detective Williams visited, his previous suspicion replaced by genuine concern. He awkwardly patted Sarah's shoulder, mumbling about immunity deals and witness protection, but Sarah barely heard him. Legal consequences meant nothing compared to the possibility of losing Daniel. But besides, she deserved punishment for her crimes. The only mercy she wanted was time with her father. The silver heart necklace became her talisman, a physical link to the truth she'd buried for so long. She remembered the day Daniel gave it to her, his eyes shining with love as he fastened it around her neck. "As long as you wear this," he had said, "you'll always know you're loved." How had she ever doubted that love? How had she allowed Christopher's twisted version of reality to override such pure truth? As dawn broke on the 4th day, Sarah dozed fitfully in her chair, still holding Daniel's hand. A slight pressure on her fingers snapped her awake. Daniel's eyes were open, focusing slowly on her face. Sarah, his voice was barely a whisper, but it was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she leaned closer. "I'm here, Dad. I'm right here." The word "Dad" felt like coming home, like finally putting down a weight she'd carried for 8 years. Daniel's lips curved in a weak smile as his fingers tightened slightly around hers. "You remembered," he managed to say, each word an effort. Sarah nodded, bringing his hand to her cheek. "I remember everything now. And I'm so sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry for believing his lies." But Daniel shook his head slightly, his eyes full of forgiveness. "Not your fault," he whispered. "Love you. More than all the stars." Emily Morgan appeared in the hospital doorway like a ghost from the past, her face lined with years of grief and regret. Sarah froze at the sight of her stepmother, Memories of warm hugs and bedtime stories crashing against the reality of abandonment. Emily's hands trembled as she took in the scene: Daniel in the hospital bed, Sarah keeping vigil beside him. I came as soon as I heard Emily's voice was thick with emotion. The news. They said Daniel had been shot, that they found you, Sarah. She took a hesitant step forward, then stopped, uncertain of her welcome. The weight of her choices hung heavy in the air between them. Sarah's initial reaction was anger. 8 years, she said, her voice sharp. You left us 8 years ago. You believed what everyone said about Dad, abandoned him when he needed you most. The words carried the accumulated pain of a child who had lost both parents in different ways. Emily's eyes filled with tears. I was wrong, so terribly wrong. She moved closer, her composure cracking. But there's something you both need to know. I never stopped looking for you, Sarah. I've spent years following leads, tracking Christopher's movements. I had to do it away from Daniel, away from the police scrutiny. She pulled out a worn notebook from her bag, pages stuffed with newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes. I knew something wasn't right about Christopher, but I couldn't prove it. The police wouldn't listen to the wife who abandoned her husband, so I started investigating on my own. Sarah took the notebook with shaking hands, seeing years of dedicated investigation laid out before her. Photos of Christopher meeting with known criminals, bank statements showing suspicious transfers, surveillance notes tracking his movements. Emily had been building a case all along. I had to make everyone believe I thought Daniel was guilty, Emily continued, her voice breaking. Christopher was watching us. If he knew I suspected him, if he knew I was investigating, she looked at Daniel's unconscious form. I couldn't risk both of you. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. While she had been trapped in Christopher's web of lies, Emily had been working tirelessly to expose the truth. The abandonment that had seemed so cruel now revealed itself as the ultimate sacrifice, a mother choosing to lose everything to save her family. "Why didn't you tell Dad?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Emily's smile was sad as she reached out to touch Daniel's hand. "Because he wears his heart on his sleeve. He couldn't have hidden the truth if he tried. I needed Christopher to believe he had won completely." A soft sound from the bed drew their attention. Daniel was awake, his eyes moving between the two women he had lost and found again. Emily, his voice was weak but clear. You never stopped believing in me." Emily moved to his side, opposite Sarah, completing their broken family circle. "Never," she whispered, taking his hand. "I'm so sorry I couldn't tell you. I'm sorry I had to hurt you to protect you. Can you ever forgive me?" Daniel's fingers tightened around hers. "You found our daughter," he said simply. You never gave up. The love in his voice, untouched by years of perceived betrayal, brought fresh tears to Emily's eyes. Sarah watched her parents reunite, feeling the last pieces of Christopher's manipulation crumble away. This was real love, not the possessive, controlling relationship Christopher had created, but the kind that sacrificed everything for another's safety and happiness. Emily turned to Sarah, her face full of hope and fear. "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. What I did, leaving you both, even for the right reasons, it caused so much pain." She reached out tentatively, and after a moment's hesitation, Sarah let herself be pulled into her stepmother's embrace. The family stood united for the first time in 8 years, their bonds stronger for having been tested by fire. Emily's sacrifice had helped bring them back together, though the path to healing would still be long and complex. But as they held each other in that quiet hospital room, they knew that love, real, selfless love, could survive even the deepest wounds. Detective Williams entered Daniel's hospital room with a thick file under his arm, his face grim with newfound knowledge. The family looked up as he cleared his throat, preparing to reveal the dark truth he had uncovered about Christopher Bennett's past. "We've been digging through sealed records," he began, spreading documents across Daniel's bedside table. Christopher's obsession with Sarah didn't start with Alexandra's death. It began much earlier with a pattern of behavior that should have raised red flags years ago. The detective pulled out an old police report, yellowed with age. 15 years ago, Christopher had a brief relationship with Rachel Stevens, Sarah's biological mother. But it wasn't the casual affair, he claimed. Rachel was his employee, barely 20 years old, and Christopher was obsessed with her. Sarah's hand found Daniels as Williams continued. Rachel filed multiple restraining orders, claiming Christopher became controlling, manipulative. When she discovered she was pregnant, she fled the state, terrified of what he might do. She gave Sarah up for adoption to protect her from him. Emily's research notes collaborated with the police findings. She had traced Rachel's movements, discovering a trail of fear and desperation. She died in a car accident 5 years ago, Emily added softly. But she left letters with her lawyer, explaining everything. She knew Christopher was still looking for the baby. More documents revealed Christopher's spiraling obsession. After Rachel disappeared, he had hired private investigators to track her down. When his own daughter Alexandra died, his fixation transferred entirely to finding Sarah. The adoption by his best friend wasn't coincidence. He had manipulated events from the shadows, ensuring Sarah would be close to him. His company records show years of preparation, Williams explained. Building the criminal network, establishing offshore accounts, creating false identities. Everything was in place long before he took Sarah. He was just waiting for the right moment. The most chilling revelation came from Christopher's private journals, discovered in a hidden safe at his compound. Pages filled with elaborate fantasies about reclaiming his perfect family detailed his growing detachment from reality. The death of Alexandra had merely accelerated a plan already in motion. He saw Sarah as his chance for redemption, Williams said, reading from the journal. Not just replacing Alexandra, but creating something he could completely control. Every aspect of her new life was designed to erase her past and reshape her into his ideal daughter. Sarah listened with growing horror as her years with Christopher took on new meaning. The training, the heists, the careful manipulation, all of it had been part of his obsessive need for control. He used to say he was making me stronger, she whispered. But he was really just breaking me down, rebuilding me the way he wanted. The detective nodded grimly. We found evidence that he had other girls before your attempts to recreate his perfect daughter. None of them worked out. You were different because you were actually his biological child. In his mind, that gave him the right to completely possess you. Emily's hands shook as she examined police photographs of Christopher's office. The walls had been covered with surveillance photos of Sarah growing up, birthday parties, school events, family outings. He had been watching, always watching, documenting every moment of the life he planned to steal. There's more, Williams said quietly. We found letters he wrote to Alexandra after her death, describing how he was saving her sister. In his mind, Sarah wasn't just his biological daughter, or a replacement for Alexandra. She was a way to rewrite his past, to be the father he failed to be before. Daniel pulled Sarah closer, protective even in his weakened state. He never loved you, he said softly. He loved the idea of you, the control you represented. Everything else was just justification for his obsession. The truth settled over the room like a heavy shroud. Christopher Bennett wasn't just a grieving father who had lost his way. He was a calculating predator who had spent years orchestrating the perfect kidnapping, the perfect manipulation, the perfect erasure of Sarah Morgan's true identity. Sarah touched her silver necklace, the symbol of real love that had survived Christopher's attempts to erase her past. He almost won, she said quietly. He almost made me forget who I really was, who my real family is. The final pieces of Christopher Bennett's carefully constructed facade crumbled during his first court appearance. The man who had presented himself as a grieving father and successful businessman was revealed to be something far more sinister. Detective Williams presented evidence that shattered Christopher's entire identity. Christopher Bennett isn't even his real name, Williams announced to the stunned courtroom. His birth name is Charles Blackwood. He legally changed it 20 years ago after a series of fraud allegations in Chicago. The detective spread photographs across the evidence table, showing different iterations of the same man across decades, each time with a new identity, a new life. Sarah sat between Daniel and Emily in the courtroom, watching as her kidnapper's true nature was exposed. Each revelation felt like another weight lifting from her shoulders, confirming that her years of manipulation had been built on an elaborate foundation of lies. The prosecution presented evidence of multiple identities, each crafted with meticulous attention to detail. Before becoming Christopher Bennett, he had been Michael Stevens in Seattle, James Crawford in Atlanta, each identity abandoned when his obsessive behaviors began to draw attention. The pattern was always the same, the prosecutor explained. He would integrate himself into wealthy communities, build trust, and then exploit that trust for his own gain. The persona of Christopher Bennett was just his most elaborate performance. Emily's investigation had uncovered even darker aspects of his past. There were other missing girls, other attempts to create his perfect family. Sarah wasn't the first young girl he had fixated on, but she was the first he had successfully molded to his will. The others had either escaped or been discarded when they failed to meet his impossible standards. The most damning evidence came from Christopher's own journals, documenting his methods of psychological manipulation. He had studied cult tactics, brainwashing techniques, and childhood development theories to create the perfect system for breaking down and rebuilding a child's identity. Each identity he assumed was a rehearsal, Williams testified. He was perfecting his methods, learning from his failures, until he found Sarah. Being her biological father gave him the justification he needed to take his obsession to its ultimate conclusion. As the evidence mounted, Christopher's composed demeanor began to crack. The charming, successful businessman disappeared, replaced by a man consumed by delusion and rage. "You don't understand," he shouted suddenly, rising from his seat. "I saved her. I made her perfect. She was meant to be mine." Sarah felt Daniel's hand tighten around hers as Christopher's outburst continued. "I gave her everything. Power, purpose, a real family. Not this weak, ordinary life you forced on her." His eyes, wild with desperation, fixed on Sarah. "But tell them, Alexandra. Tell them how I made you extraordinary." But Sarah stood firm, her voice steady as she addressed him for the first time since the warehouse. "My name is Sarah Morgan," she said clearly. "You didn't make me extraordinary. You made me a prisoner. Everything you gave me was stolen from other people, stolen from my real family, stolen from my true self." Christopher's face contorted with rage and disbelief as the last vestiges of his control slipped away. The mask of Christopher Bennett, respected businessman and grieving father, shattered completely, revealing Charles Blackwood, a manipulator who had spent decades perfecting the art of stealing not just valuables, but entire lives. As the trial continued, Christopher's true motive for taking Sarah emerged, far more twisted than anyone had imagined. A series of emails recovered from his private server revealed a decades-long vendetta against Daniel Morgan, predating even Sarah's adoption. It wasn't just about having his biological daughter, the prosecutor explained, displaying the evidence on courtroom screens. Morgan Industries had outbid Bennett Corporation on a major development project 20 years ago. That loss triggered Christopher's downward spiral, leading to his company's bankruptcy and his wife's departure. Sarah listened in horror as the full scope of Christopher's plan unfolded. Her kidnapping hadn't just been about recreating his family, it was an elaborate revenge plot designed to destroy Daniel completely. Christopher had orchestrated every detail, from ensuring Sarah's adoption file crossed Daniel's desk to positioning himself as the trusted family friend. The criminal enterprise was never the end goal, Detective Williams testified. But it was a means to an end. Christopher needed Sarah to become a criminal so that when he finally revealed the truth, it would destroy not just Daniel's heart, but his entire legacy. Imagine the headlines: prominent businessman's daughter revealed as master criminal. Emily's research had uncovered a series of offshore accounts set up in Daniel's name, ready to be exposed at the perfect moment. Christopher had planned to frame Daniel for orchestrating the heists, using Sarah's testimony to confirm his guilt. The ultimate betrayal would have come from the daughter he had spent years searching for. Each robbery targeted someone connected to Daniel's past success, the prosecutor continued. Every person who had chosen Morgan Industries over Bennett Corporation, every deal that had contributed to Christopher's downfall. He was systematically destroying Daniel's business network while training his daughter to deliver the final blow. Sarah's hands trembled as she read through Christopher's detailed plans. Notes about her training included psychological assessments, tracking her gradual transformation from Daniel's loving daughter to Christopher's perfect weapon. Conditioning progressing well. One entry read, "Subject shows decreasing emotional response to target's distress. Morgan's influence nearly eliminated." The most chilling evidence came from Christopher's private video logs. In one recording, he spoke directly to the camera. "Daniel Morgan took everything from me. My company, my reputation, my family. Now I've taken the thing he loves most, twisted it into something that will destroy him." Poetic justice, wouldn't you say? Daniel sat stoically through the revelations, his hand never leaving Sarah's. When asked to testify about the impact of Christopher's actions, he spoke not of his own suffering, but of Sarah's. "He didn't just take my daughter," Daniel said, his voice steady. "He tried to erase her. Every laugh, every memory, every moment of joy, he tried to replace it all with darkness." The courtroom fell silent as Sarah finally understood the full weight of what had been done to her. She hadn't just been kidnapped, she had been weaponized, turned into an instrument of destruction aimed at the heart of her own family. Every skill she had learned, every operation she had led, had been another step toward destroying the father who had never stopped loving her. "But he failed," Sarah declared, standing to address the court. "He could make me forget my name, my past, even my own father. But he couldn't make me forget love. The necklace, the memories, the feeling of being truly loved, those were too deep for even his manipulation to erase." Christopher sat motionless, his careful facade completely gone, as his ultimate plan was exposed. What he had intended as a masterpiece of revenge had become the evidence of his own monstrosity. The truth behind Sarah's kidnapping wasn't a story of fatherly love or second chances, it was a chronicle of obsession, revenge, and the darkest kind of manipulation. Emily's testimony brought another shocking dimension to the case. Standing before the court, she revealed the intricate web of surveillance and investigation she had maintained during her years of apparent abandonment. "I knew something was wrong the moment Sarah disappeared," Emily explained, her voice steady despite her evident emotion. The way Christopher responded, it was too perfect, too rehearsed. While everyone was looking at Daniel, I started watching Christopher. She presented years of meticulously gathered evidence, photographs, surveillance logs, financial records. Working under an assumed name, she had tracked Christopher's movements across multiple states, documenting his pattern of criminal activities and his obsession with Sarah. The hardest part wasn't gathering the evidence, Emily testified, looking directly at Daniel. It was staying away. "I knew if Christopher suspected I was investigating him, he would either move Sarah somewhere we'd never find her, or—" She paused, composing herself. "Or worse." Her investigation had uncovered a network of safe houses, each carefully maintained and ready for use. She had photographed Sarah from afar numerous times over the years, documenting her transformation from a happy child to Christopher's trained operative. Each photo was dated and marked with her observations, creating a timeline of Sarah's lost years. "I made contact with Rachel Stevens' lawyer 3 years ago," Emily continued. She had left detailed letters about Christopher's obsession, about her fear for her unborn child. Those letters confirmed what I had suspected. This wasn't just about Alexandra's death. This was something much darker. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as Emily described how she had systematically built her case, working with a small team of trusted private investigators. She had lived in cheap motels, worked under assumed names, and sacrificed everything to protect her investigation. Every lead I followed, every piece of evidence I gathered, brought me closer to Sarah, Emily said, her voice breaking slightly. But I couldn't risk moving too soon. One wrong move, and we might have lost her forever. The final piece of her investigation had been the revelation about Christopher's true identity. Emily had tracked down his ex-wife from his previous life as Charles Blackwood, uncovering a pattern of obsessive behavior that predated even Alexandra's death. Sarah watched her stepmother with new understanding, seeing not the woman who had abandoned them, but a mother who had sacrificed everything to save her child. Emily's investigation had been the silent foundation upon which Sarah's eventual rescue had been built. As Emily concluded her testimony, she turned to face her family. "I know I can never fully make up for leaving," she said, tears finally falling. "But everything I did, every moment I spent away, was to bring our family back together." The prosecutor presented Emily's evidence methodically, building an irrefutable case that demonstrated not just Christopher's guilt, but the extraordinary lengths one mother had gone to save her child. In the end, Emily's years of secret investigation had become the key to not just Sarah's freedom, but to the family's redemption. Back home at the Morgan house, Sarah stood in her old bedroom, untouched after 8 years, feeling the weight of memories wash over her. Daniel and Emily watched from the doorway as their daughter rediscovered pieces of herself among the preserved remnants of her childhood. "You kept everything exactly the same," Sarah whispered, picking up her old stuffed bear from the bed. The room was a time capsule of happiness, dance trophies still gleaming on shelves, family photos smiling from the walls, her favorite books lined up precisely as she'd left them. Daniel stepped forward, his hand finding Emily's. "I couldn't change anything," he admitted. "This room was my connection to you. Some nights I'd sit here for hours, remembering how you used to read your stories out loud, how you'd practice your ballet moves in front of the mirror." Emily moved to the closet, pulling out a stack of carefully preserved papers. "We saved every drawing you made, every school report, every birthday card." Her fingers trembled as she handed them to Sarah. "We never stopped believing you'd come home." The family spent hours going through Sarah's belongings, each item triggering memories that helped reconstruct her true identity. They laughed over old photographs, cried over forgotten moments, and slowly began rebuilding the bonds that Christopher had tried to destroy. "Remember this?" Daniel held up a slightly crooked ceramic bowl. "Your first art project. You were so proud because you made it all by yourself." Sarah took the bowl, memories flooding back of sunny afternoons spent at the kitchen table, clay under her fingernails, her parents praising every creation. The healing wasn't instant or easy. Some nights Sarah would wake up screaming from nightmares of her time with Christopher. Daniel and Emily would rush to her room, holding her until the terror passed, reassuring her that she was safe, she was home, she was loved. Other times, Sarah would find herself unconsciously slipping into old habits from her criminal training. But instead of shame, she found understanding. Her parents helped her channel those skills into positive outlets. Her precision became an asset in art classes. Her strategic thinking excelled in chess tournaments. The most powerful moments of healing came in the small, ordinary acts of family life. Sunday morning pancakes resumed, though now Sarah helped make them. Family movie nights returned, with all three squeezing onto the couch like no time had passed. They were building new memories while honoring the old ones, creating a bridge between past and present. "We're not trying to erase the last 8 years," Daniel told her one evening. "They're part of your story now, but they don't define you. You're Sarah Morgan, our daughter, our miracle, our home." The community's redemption began with a letter from Mrs. Peterson, the neighbor who had once publicly denounced Daniel. "I was wrong," she wrote, her handwriting shaky with emotion. "We all were. Can you ever forgive us for doubting you?" More letters followed, Hundreds of them from former business associates, old friends, and complete strangers. Each expressed remorse for believing the worst, for abandoning the Morgans in their darkest hour. The local newspaper, which had once vilified Daniel, ran a front-page apology and a comprehensive story about Christopher's deception. The church that had asked them to leave now reached out with open arms. Pastor Michael visited personally, tears in his eyes as he asked for forgiveness. "Our congregation would be honored," he said, "if you would consider coming home to us." The following Sunday, the Morgans returned to find the entire congregation standing in support. Sarah's old school organized a special ceremony acknowledging their role in spreading suspicion and dedicating a scholarship in her name for children of traumatic circumstances. Her former teachers came forward with memories they had been afraid to share during the dark years, stories of her kindness and creativity that helped rebuild her true identity. The country club that had suggested Daniel's resignation now offered lifetime membership to the entire family. Business partners who had distanced themselves rushed to renew connections, though Daniel was selective about whom he trusted again. The community's support, while welcome, couldn't instantly erase 8 years of doubt and abandonment. Detective Williams made a public statement admitting the police department's failure to properly investigate Christopher. "We let our biases blind us," he declared. "The Morgan family deserved better." He personally supervised a review of similar cases, ensuring no other family would suffer the same injustice. Local businesses showed their support in practical ways. The cafe where Sarah had once done homework offered free coffee for life. The bookstore created a special reading corner dedicated to missing children's awareness. The dance studio where she had taken ballet lessons invited her to teach weekend classes for young girls. Most touching were the efforts of the children Sarah had grown up with, now young adults themselves. They organized a community gathering in the park where they had once played together, sharing memories and offering friendship without judgment. "We never forgot you," her childhood best friend Jenny said, hugging her tight. "We just didn't know how to help." The community's redemption wasn't just about apologies, it was about active support for the family's healing. When Sarah experienced anxiety in public places, neighbors formed a protective circle around her. When she struggled with trust issues, former skeptics became her strongest advocates. Through it all, the Morgans accepted the support with grace, understanding that healing wasn't just about their family, but about rebuilding an entire community's faith in love and truth. As Daniel often said, forgiveness isn't about forgetting, it's about choosing to move forward together. 1 year after Sarah's return, the Morgan family stood together in their backyard, hosting a celebration of healing and new beginnings. The garden, once neglected during the dark years, now bloomed with fresh life, a metaphor for their own renewal. Sarah, now studying art therapy at Boston University, had found her calling helping other trauma survivors. Her experiences under Christopher's control had given her unique insight into the healing process. Sometimes, she told her patients, the deepest wounds can become our greatest source of strength. Daniel had transformed Morgan Industries into a foundation supporting missing children's causes and family reunification efforts. The pain of his own experience fueled his determination to prevent other families from suffering similar fates. Emily worked alongside him, using her investigative skills to help law enforcement improve their response to missing persons cases. The silver heart necklace, now joined by a new pendant given by both her parents, remained Sarah's constant companion. "The old one reminds me of who I was," she explained. "The new one represents who I'm becoming. Together, they tell my whole story." Christopher's sentencing had brought final closure. Before being led away to serve multiple life terms, he had attempted one last manipulation, claiming everything he'd done was for love. Sarah's response became a symbol of her healing. Real love doesn't cage people, it sets them free. The family's bond grew stronger through their shared healing. Sunday pancake breakfasts resumed, now with Sarah adding her own creative twists to the recipes. Movie nights featured not just princess films, but documentaries about survival and recovery, sparking deep discussions about resilience and growth. They established new traditions while honoring old ones. The treehouse Daniel had built was restored, becoming Sarah's private art studio. Family dinner conversations included honest discussions about their feelings, fears, and hopes. No emotion was too difficult to share, no memory too painful to acknowledge. Kevin remained a constant presence, having earned his place as honorary family member. His unwavering support during the darkest times had transformed him from investigator to trusted friend. He often joined their weekend gatherings, bringing case files of other missing children, working tirelessly to create more happy endings. The community continued its support, but the Morgans had learned to be selective about their relationships. They surrounded themselves with people who had demonstrated true loyalty, understanding that trust, once broken, must be carefully rebuilt. Sarah's recovery became a beacon of hope for other families of missing children. She spoke at conferences, sharing her story not as a victim, but as a survivor. Her message was always one of hope. Love leaves breadcrumbs even in the darkest forest. Sometimes we just need help following them home. On this particular evening, as the sun set over their gathered friends and family, Daniel raised a toast. To healing he began, his voice strong with emotion. To second chances, to unbreakable bonds, and to love that never gives up. Emily added her own words: to truth that overcomes lies, to light that defeats darkness, and to family in all its forms. Sarah completed the toast, her voice carrying the wisdom of one who had journeyed through darkness and found her way back to light, to home. Not just the place, but the feeling. The knowledge that no matter how far we wander, love will always lead us back. As twilight wrapped around them like a gentle embrace, the Morgan family stood united, their story a testament to the enduring power of love, the strength of truth, and the endless possibility of healing. They had emerged from their darkest chapter not just surviving, but thriving, proving that even the deepest wounds can become doorways to profound transformation. If this story of love, redemption, and unbreakable family bonds has touched your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What moment resonated with you the most? Share the video with family and friends who believe in the power of unconditional love. Your support through likes and subscriptions helps us continue bringing these meaningful stories to life. Together, let's celebrate the triumph of love over darkness and spread hope to those who need it most. Join our growing community of storytellers and dreamers. Your next favorite story awaits.